And so let's continue talking about Olaudah Equiano, who is an extraordinary example, as your NAEL suggests, of a self-made man. And a self-made man may be everything that the male romantics are talking about, is the creation of a self through the imagination. And this man, Olaudah, has an extraordinary breadth and depth of experience. He almost goes all the way around the world through all of his experiences being a slave. And he even at one point is a slave overseer and a hairdresser. He goes from one end to the other of so many different kinds and styles of people. He has an enormously large range. And I would suggest to you, too, that he has an enormously large range when it comes to the kind of man and he is, the kind of brain and imagination that he has. He's very active, unlike the stereotype of the slave being passive. He's questioning. He wants to know everything. He has desire. He speaks very courageously at different moments in the life of being a slave. He is also very vulnerable and sensitive and open to the world, and he's very sensitive to his very senses to be aware of what's around him. So when we look at this first chapter that we're given, I want you to notice that section where he talks about entering this room and seeing a watch, and then he sees a picture on the wall. And with many of us, sometimes that bizarre experience of feeling like the eyes in the portrait are following you everywhere. Well, he has that same experience. But I would suggest to you that this moment is an imaginary moment of also representing his sense of being watched all the time, but also his sense of needing to watch others all the time, particularly white people, because they kind of always lie to him and may put on the face of kindness and generosity and then undercut that brutally. So he has a little bit, I would suggest, of PTSD, of needing to be aware of everything around him in case something brutal or awful or dangerous to his life is going to occur. So this is the kind of man he is. Notice on that next page, page 100 for mine, where at the bottom, one of his owners just wants to change his name. I mean, probably what is his real name is difficult to tell because there are so many name changes. And part of being a human being is being able to name yourself. And lacking power is when someone names you. On that next page, notice this wonderful moment where he decides that he wants to learn and that books and reading and writing are the power of the imagination through which perhaps he can obtain freedom. And he talks about books. I had a great curiosity to talk to the books, not only to read them, but to talk to them and to put his ear to the books, literally. So there's this wonderful sensibility, this vulnerability to the world around him. But this desire not only to hear the books, but to talk back to them, to dialogue with them, which is part of what the Romantics are doing, is talking back to all the books of history that they have been loaded down with. Notice that strange and sad moment where he's with the little white girl. This is on page 102, and he thinks like the little white girl, when she washes her face, she will have a rosy white face, and that perhaps if he washes his face, he will too. And then you have his description of how his heart burns within him on page 102. My heart burned within me while I thought the time long till I obtained my freedom. always keeping alive in himself, and this is a mastery of the imagination, keeping alive this hope and burning desire for freedom. He is at one point, then again, this long narrative about how his owner loved him, would do anything for him, promised him he would set him free once they were in England on English soil. And when they get there, of course, this man sells him to another man as a slave. Alauda then uses his own brain and his own imagination and rationality to speak back to the owner and say, that's illegal, you're on English land, you cannot do that on English land. And so this, symbolic understanding of slavery as lawless, and that the owners under such a slave system can do whatever they want. They don't have to abide by the laws. And then at the end of this section that we have, this last section is quite brutal and speaks of the physicality of being a slave and of the tortures that are done upon the slave's body, which also brings up this irrationality again, one of the tropes, this irrationality of slavery. Why brutalize the very thing or product that you bought that you're going to make money by, if that is what slavery, the role of slavery is for? It also brings up the sort of sadism that underlies the slave owner. Then we turn to Hannah More, a rather conservative female writer from the time period, who's very influential. And she also imagines from the point of view of a female slave who has a child that dies in slavery. And she uses the tropes of, showing that the slaves are human. They have familial longings, they have children they love. This trope of the slave owner as only seeking gold, as being greedy for money. This idea of conversion, which is very conservative, and we need to be aware that not all the anti-slave pieces were completely radical in their thinking. This idea that, if only the slave will become converted, then that will make up for everything that has happened to them. Indeed, this suggestion, that everybody must suffer according to Christianity, and so slavery can be put within that mode of suffering that we must go through. And the idea expressed at the end, where Yamamba says, "Now I'll bless my cruel capture, hence I've known a Savior's name, till my grief is turned to rapture and I half forget the blame," that it is her duty to forgive the slave owners, and that she's glad she became a slave and was captured, because that allowed her to obtain Christianity, which would be one of the arguments of the slave masters. All right, let's stop there.